Welcome to the View magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. I'm Trystan Kent. This episode is part of our series on the challenges facing refugees in the UK and abroad. Please note, this episode discusses topics that listeners may find distressing, including homophobia, transphobia, and mentions of sexual assault. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr S Chelvan, an activist human rights lawyer, head of immigration and law at 33 Bedford Row, and visiting adjunct professor at the University of Southampton. Dr Chelvan specialises in supporting LGBTQ+ asylum applications. According to the Williams Institute, LGBTQ+ people are vulnerable to discrimination, persecution, and violence throughout the migratory process. This includes on arrival to the UK, to what former Lib Dem spokesperson for Home Affairs Christine Jardine called the Home Office's culture of disbelief. Dr Chelvan has successfully supported countless LGBTQ+ asylum claims, as well as having created the Difference, Stigma, Shame and Harm, or DISH model, a positive tool to process LGBTQ+ asylum claims in a humane way that is now being used around the world. We speak with Dr Chelvan about his fantastic work and discuss some of the challenges faced by LGBTQ+ people in the asylum process. Dr Chelvan, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you, Trystan?
Not too bad, thanks. Thank you so much for coming onto the Rebel Justice podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Really delighted to speak to you. So I thought we could start by getting a bit of your background and how you became a human rights lawyer, in particular supporting LGBTQ+ refugees.
Well, I self-identify as queer, a person of colour, first-generation immigrant living with a disability. I have a 40 decibel hearing loss in my left ear. Predominantly state school, predominantly not straight, but importantly, I'm sort of describing you my identity. And I was born in Sri Lanka in 1974, came over here when I was 4 years of age. My mother was already here in 1977 doing some postgrad qualifications as an anaesthetist, and there were anti-Tamil rights in Colombo. So my parents decided it'd be safer for my brother and I to come over here the following year, in 1978. So I'm proud to call myself an immigrant. I am an immigrant. But I also know that my difference, and as a person of colour growing up in Sussex, for me, my parents always brought us up with a very positive sense of identity and our culture, even though in the late 70s and 80s, whenever, I didn't know who this man was, and I now know through hindsight, Powell and, National Front came on TV. My parents used to switch over the channel. My parents would have known about claiming asylum. And we were very fortunate to piggyback on my mother's visa as her dependent. And we had indefinitely to remain in those days within 3 years. But it was that sense of difference, that importance of difference that spurred me in relation to why it's important to represent myself within society. And my mother worked in the NHS for over 30 years. And I've had generations in my family who were civil servants in all sorts of different roles where the calling to public service was very strong. And then at 14, two things happened. Growing up in Worthing, my parents wanted me to be a doctor, but my mother said work experience at my local day school was like, you've done so much for medicine, look at something else. So I worked as a barrister, and I loved it. I always was involved in school drama and stuff like that, and I loved standing on a chair in Cookville Primary School when I was 5 years old and reciting Goldilocks and Three Bears. And what spurred me on was watching people around me listen to every word I spoke. So I was the storyteller. And then I worked at a barrister at Worthing Law Courts, and I thought, this is what I want to do. This is my passion. I remember going home and telling my parents, my mother said, no, don't be silly, you'll be a doctor and then you can be a barrister. But then also in April 1989, and the date's important because Section 28 had come into force, which was the anti-gay pretend family legislation, Section 2A of the Local Government Act 1988. And of course, I didn't know about the law, but I was at a Roman Catholic high school, Chatsmore High School in Goring, and my RE teacher said homosexuality wasn't mental illness. And I knew, thanks to Derek Jarman and Sebastian, that I was attracted to men. I was different. And that tension grew where I knew I was leading a double life, leading the life my parents wanted me to lead on the outside, but knowing that I could never be that person from what I was feeling in the inside. And that narrative of difference very much followed through to the point, fast forward 7 years, to when I was 21, and a week before my first three exams, my mother asked me, Chelvan, are you gay? And she said, if you are, don't worry, I will still continue to love you. And this was my one barrier in being myself and coming out, because I'd come out to friends at university the year before and started having relationships with boyfriends. Luckily, all had androgynous names like Jamie and Francis and stuff like that. Of course, my family didn't know, but my social circle did. And I said, yes, I am. Then the following morning, I woke up and my mother was on the phone to my father. They were separated at the time. And they gave me two options: either be celibate for 5 years and they'll get me married off to some sort of girl, which my friends thought, this is ridiculous. You can't be celibate for 5 minutes, let alone 5 years, or you'd have to leave the home. And that wasn't really a choice. So I went to Southampton, and my mother sent my stuff in 18 dusting bags and 19 cardboard boxes, and a letter via her solicitor saying that I'd been disowned and disinherited until I recanted my behaviour and practices. Now, this was the mid-90s, and Armistead Morgan says you have your biological family and your chosen family. And Southampton was my chosen family. And they very much supported me in my politics tutor, Caroline Thomas, who's no longer with us, said, every time I fell down, you've got so much more to give. So for me, in the mid-90s, where there was an unequal age of consent, there was a ban on openly gay and lesbian people serving the armed forces. And, I was a student activist, and Southampton had, well ahead of its time, an anti-discrimination policy, and I was part of the anti-discrimination working group. And, the armed forces used to go to careers fairs and recruit people. And I said, well, somebody like me can't be recruited because I'm gay. And this is wrong. And I remember taking this to University Court because I was a student representative and saying, well, the engineering faculty get a lot of money from the armed forces. And how can they? Because it's contrary to the Armed Forces Act, contrary to the Equal Opportunities Policy. And I remember John Lowry, as the executive registrar at Southampton, said, but it's lawful. And I thought, well, I've got to do something about changing the law. The ban on gay men giving blood only until recently under various caveats. There was no civil partnership, let alone equal marriage. So for me, going to the bar, going to the law was purely selfish. It was to empower myself as somebody who was different. And the fact that I could use my skills in advocacy and my love and passion for the law as a rights vehicle to empower myself meant that if I empowered others, then so be it. That's fantastic. But I wanted to the political theorists talk about the citizen being active or passive, and the whole issue about if you want to change the world, you've got to be part of that change. And for me, I'd lost everything from my family for being open and true to myself. That I knew that as an advocate, as a barrister, the people who made those arguments, which were then reported in those cases which I was reading, that I could change the world by not being a politician and playing the game of politics, but going before a judge, making my legal submissions. And this comes to my USP, to be the mouthpiece of those who know the words but have no voice, to be an advocate, that I could change lives and save lives by going to the bar.
It's an incredible story. What does your work look like when supporting LGBTQ plus people going through the asylum process? What are the barriers that tend to come up? What are the challenges that you're often facing in your work?
Well, I'm a storyteller and I'm an interpreter. My role as a storyteller is to tell the stories of my clients. And I'm an interpreter because I interpret their stories into the foreign language of the law. But I can't interpret their stories unless they're given that safe space to tell their story. And that's my driving force, in all the roles I have. For me, the greatest hurdle for use the umbrella term of queer for anybody who's non-conformative to a straight cisgender stereotype, who are different, is the greatest hurdle is to prove that you're queer, gay. And to give you a brief history of refugee law in the UK since the 1951 Convention, it was only in 1999 that women in the law in the UK were recognised as having a freestanding refugee claim, 48 years after the framing of the Refugee Convention, a case called Shah and Islam. And in what I call the Overton breadcrumb judicial table, Lord Stane said, well, homosexuals must be included in that. And that's quite tragic, such a historical wrong, because as we know, in those photographs of the Holocaust and the labour and concentration camps, where the Jews who were being murdered in the gas chambers were wearing the Star of David, gay men were wearing the pink triangle, lesbians black. We were part of the persecution. And yes, the Refugee Convention arose through not just the Holocaust, but the mass exodus of peoples across Europe at that time. So the fact that women were out of the ambit of protection and gay men as well. But in 1989, UK law was basically, sex is something you can refrain from. And it's all about sex. And I wish my life as a gay man is all about sex. I think my husband would have a few things to say about that. But, it's all kind of about sex. So you can refrain from sex. So you can't get protection of the Refugee Convention. That's in a case called Bombesi in 1989. And then what happened was, Labour has this wonderful agenda of saying we are always supportive of LGBTQ people. But between 2004 and 2010, under a Labour government, under Tony Blair, under Gordon Brown, under Yvette Cooper, under so many Home Secretaries, there was something called the discretion test, which was employed. And it said, so, Trystan, if I point a gun towards you, would you run towards the gun or away from the gun?
I would run very fast away from the gun.
So it's a fight or flight principle. So there's an Australian case called S395 in the High Court of Australia in 2003 about two Bangladeshi gay men. And then in a case called Z in November 2004, the Home Office, through their lawyers in this case, said, well, no, what it is that case would be interpreted that you can be sent back to a country and you'll be voluntarily discreet because you'll run away from the gun. And unless it's not reasonably tolerable, we can send you back. So between 2004 and 2010, 98% of refugee claims by lesbian, gay and bisexual people, the Home Office said, yeah, we accept you're lesbian. We accept that you're gay. We accept that you're bisexual. But because we find that you'll be voluntarily discreet, we can send you back to Iran, which will hang you, or Jamaica as a lesbian, there's a high risk of curative rape or murder, because you'll be voluntarily discreet. Trans weren't caught by that because, of course, you can't be discreet because there's your outward expression of your gender identity. So that was the discretion test under the Labour government. Labour politicians get very angry with me when I have to highlight that Labour sent lesbian, gay and bisexual asylum seekers to their deaths to be silent for the rest of their lives. Then in 2010, actually on the days of the election results, so the first day Labour was in government, the second day it was the Tories and Lib Dems, and the Lib Dems had a real clear policy against discretion. So on the third day before the Supreme Court, we were expecting the government case to collapse, because the Liberal Democrats say we do not support the discretion test, but they continue. And 5 white male judges in the Supreme Court said, well, look, no straight man would find that discretion tolerable. It's a case called H.J. Iran and H.T. Cameroon, handed down by the Supreme Court later on that year, on 7th of July. And I was representing a gay Cameroonian man called H.T. Cameroon in the Court of Appeal as junior counsel. Wasn't in the Supreme Court, but was there as a legal advisor. And they said, okay, so there's a new test, and it's discretion of disbelief, because what they say is that first issue is to prove that you're gay or perceived to be gay. Secondly, are openly gay people have a well-founded fear of persecution? That's important because the majority of people in these countries aren't open. They have to lead double lives because if they're identified or identifiable, they will face death, rape, or various other forms of torture. And then the third limb is, will the person be open? And very few people will be open. Very few people will run towards a gun. Actually, one of my lesbian Jamaican clients, it was accepted that the genie had gone out of the bottle, that she, even with a real risk of curative rape and murder, she will go back to Jamaica and be open. Or they say that you can be refused asylum if your discretion is due to only social or personal reasons. But if a material reason is fear of persecution, then you're a refugee. Now, I call that the disbeliefs charter, because having established that you're gay or lesbian, which is now it's confident discretion to disbelief, it was that proving that you're gay. And by that time, I'd done a lot of work and then established this practice in lesbian, gay, bisexual asylum, which nobody else was really doing it. And I was starting winning cases on this and starting doing policy work. And I realized, well, how does somebody prove that they're gay? So I started a PhD at King's in 2008. And I thought, well, what are the issues? And the main issue is the identification and knowledge of difference. Because the only reason the individual is persecuted is because they are different from the potential persecutor. And in queer asylum claims, it's because they do not conform to the stereotype of a heteronormative cisgendered individual that the persecutor says is acceptable. So I developed a model called the DISH model, difference, stigma, shame, and harm. Because once you recognize your difference, which is usually a positive, like, oh my God, this explains who I am, because there are other people like me, the penny drops. And stigma, because you have your family, cultural, social, anti-gay thoughts, what I call the Adam and Eve rather than Adam and Steve. My husband used to remember when he was growing up, Church of England, the priest in the pulpit always talking about the horrors of homosexuality. And then after stigma, shame, because it's the feeling you get due to your recognition that those around you do not accept your identity. Different stigma, shame comes through the majority of narratives of queer people the world over. What makes a refugee is the harm which will be directed to them because of their identity. So I created this model in 2011 as a non-intrusive, positive tool to assist a queer refugee. The statement should be drafted prior to even claiming asylum, or definitely prior to the substantive interview, because my clients sit down and I get 40 pages of a statement, 30, 40 pages, because it's their life story. And the devil's always in the detail. So UNHCR endorsed the model in their international guidelines in 2012. I remember going to a meeting and somebody there who represented the national government, who I can't identify for obvious reasons, said, "We know what normal is." And very quickly realised I was in the room and that shouldn't have been said. So for me, my role as a litigator, as a barrister, was also now coming into policy work and academic work by creating a model which was endorsed by UNHCR. And then in February 2013, I did the Stonewall lecture, and just before that, there'd been an interview of a bisexual asylum seeker in Haslar, near Portsmouth, where the immigration officer asked him, "What attracts you about a man's backside? Did you ejaculate in him, or did he ejaculate in you?" These are actual questions by a UK Home Office immigration officer in an interview. That hit the Observer. So that interview was late 2012. That hit the Observer by January, February. Theresa May, who's then Home Secretary, asked John Vine, the independent chief inspector, to do a study, in relation to how gay asylum seekers are treated. And then they got in touch with me. I told about the DISH model. That was one of their recommendations to the Home Office. The Home Office accepted and started using the DISH model in 2014-15. By the way, I've never trademarked, so I don't get any money out of it. I actually lose money because my clients now have a mechanism to be able to tell their story. And, even in couple of weeks' time, in beginning of December, I'm going to Malta to train over 100. Well, I was training 120 EU judges a couple of weeks ago on the model. It's used globally. In 2015, the UNHCR said it's their preferred model. And, one of my clients, Adronke Parta, was in the system for 13 years. And it was only after enabling her to tell her story through this model in 2016 that the Home Office conceded her claim in August 2017. So, I never say it's the prescribed, it's about an emotional journey, because that's what refugee is. It's a physical and emotional journey. And it gives the ability for refugees to tell their story.
That's incredible. It's had such an impact. And so you said it's now being used globally. So countries all around the world have adopted this?
I mean, ironically, 2020 September, I was invited by UNHCR to give a training session to the aptly named Torture Tribunal in Hong Kong. I didn't realise before giving my training that they have a 0.6% approval rate for refugees. That's compared to UK, where around 50% of initial decisions are grants of refugee status or leave to remain, and another approximate 50%, so 70 to 80% of those claim asylum in the UK are granted refugee status or some sort of leave to remain. In Hong Kong, at tribunal level, it's 0.6%, 0.6%. And so I gave training to people on the tribunal. And the following day, I think there was a case involving a sexual identity client. I'm not going to give too many details, but I was told by one of my NGO colleagues that the adjudicator had been at my training, had read the notes and granted asylum to that refugee the following morning. So that's impact, which I'm very proud of. If it assists refugees in telling their stories and saving their lives, then I'm very touched and honoured and proud to do that, be able to be part of that story.
Wow, it's absolutely staggering. So before the DISH model was there, those examples you gave of the really grotesque, invasive questions being asked, were people just given a lot of discretion there? Was there any model they were following at all? Or
there was no model. That was the whole point. And as an academic, I thought, well, that's what I'm proudest about. And I'm proud to be a legal aid lawyer. I mean, I won the Legal Aid Barrister of the Year in 2014 and was a judge for the Lally Awards 2015 to 20. And I call it the Legal Aid Oscars, because we opt out of the big money and we opt in making sure that our clients get representation. And successive governments are sick and tired of us winning cases to brand us as left-wing lawyer. I mean, I'm proud to call myself an activist lawyer, because there are two types of barristers. I was told very, very early on in my career, the first instance barrister who goes into a case and just wins a case and that's it. Where there's people like me, I call us idiots, but that's my own self-deprecation, who look at a case and say, well, oh, wow, that's an interesting point to run in the Court of Appeal. And I will do that continuously, because that's how my brain works. And that's why I look at applying the law, but also changing the law where I feel that there needs to be positive change. And I make no excuse. And I was recently giving evidence to the Parliament in relation to legal aid in January 2021. And I said, all these politicians, you're all activists. If you were happy with the law, why would you go to become an MP? You're there to change the law. So what I find is that what lawyers do, and I love being a barrister, is that we use our brain cells to empower our clients. And I'm not going to apologize for that. I find it highly intellectually stimulating. And you find that it's not that we're left wing, it's just that we're brighter.
Absolutely. It's also quite sneaky to suggest that you're the ones agitating positive change, as if there was a sort of neutrality position that wasn't a stance in and of itself.
I mean, I have to be clear. I've never been instructed by the Home Office because I've never applied to be on panel. But I've worked with the Home Office for over a decade in policy work because I do believe, and I want to put this on record, that there are people within the Home Office, especially at management level and senior policy work people, who are on the same page. We want to make sure that the UK complies with its international treaty obligations. We're there for a common cause, to look at the issues in relation to ensuring that the UK is complying with the international treaty and domestic obligations. It's an issue of developing a relationship of respect and trust. For me, it's about using soft power. And that's what immigrants have to do. My mother was in the NHS. She told my younger brother now, she kept on telling us, you guys will have to be 10 times better than the white kids at school. She never said white kids, you're the English kids. She never used colour. But she reminded us as a woman of colour, she reminded us, but I have to be 100 times better. And that really drove our things. I mean, my brother does a lot of work regarding race and the NHS in the North East. It drives our passion in relation to inclusion and diversity and equality, is that there's so much more to do. For those people who say, refugees and all this nonsense which is going on about illegal migrants. I mean, if we have time, I can give you a legal lecture about they're not illegal, and there's case law on this. And it's only Section 40 of the Nationality and Borders Act 2022, which came into force on 28th of June this year, which possibly could make them legal. But even the explanatory memorandum said, it would be a decision for the CPS if this applied to refugees. So the use of those terminologies makes me angry because it's inaccurate. It's untrue. But that's what I love about my work. As I said, that's why we have the separation of powers and the checks and balances. And this morning's judgment in the Supreme Court on the Scottish referendum is about, there's a case called Attorney General in Jackson, in, I think it's 2005, which says Parliament is sovereign, supreme, but it's the courts which interpret the law. And thank God we do have independent judges, because it's about checks and balances. We saw that with the Gina Miller case and Brexit, is that politicians will do their best, especially under the current political regime, to bend the law in a way, or make the law in a way, which protects them from challenge. And it's ironic that Owen Paterson, person who caused part of Boris Johnson's initial downfall, is now going to the European Court of Human Rights to say that the procedure was contrary to his right to privacy under Article 8 of the European Convention. These politicians who argued against the European Convention of Human Rights are now going to Europe to get there. I mean, the hypocrisy is incredible. But these are politicians. They don't have to have integrity. I mean, I know that's a label, but that's why, my best friend Norma, my husband, forbid me from ever going into politics because I get too angry. But for me, the fact that I can go before an independent judge and argue a case is magic.
Is there a certain amount of artistic spin or interpretation there? Like, there are these rules that are written out, but you do need someone there fighting the corner for queer people, fighting the corner for refugees, because otherwise, the framework itself is vulnerable to being abused in some way, depending on who's wielding it. Is that a fair assessment?
I suppose we'll say that the law is not properly applied. That's a real risk, because the law is there to protect. I mean, I love that sort of political theory. I reminded my old political theory professor, David Owen at Southampton. He talked about a lecture he was doing about American black civil rights, and I reminded him about his lecture about Hobbes and the Leviathan and the artifice, and the only reason why we have law, that we go from the primordial soup from amphibia to humans, and then we bump into each other and cause conflict. I can still tell you which lecture theatre it was in the mid-90s where I heard him, and that was my spark in relation to why we have the law. And if you're unrepresented, even though judges are supposed to do their best to assist you, you run the risk of the law not being properly applied if you are a genuine individual seeking protection. So a lot of my clients, I get a lot of clients who've not been through the system once, but a lot of clients I get to represent have been through the system not only once, but twice, but 3 times. And they've been let down, not necessarily by the Home Office or not necessarily by judges, but also including their previous representatives. So that's where I get parachuted in to unravel. I mean, the bar is a profession where, you go into the courtroom, you have your opponent, you argue, then we walk outside and we're professionals. I was in chambers with Suella Braverman, the current Home Secretary, between 2011 and 2015. We shared chambers together. And clearly I'm not going to say anything about her today, but we know how people tick. What is their underlying rationale for doing things? And for me, it's like stepping outside that, making sure that those people I get the honor to represent get the benefit of my knowledge and experience to fight their corner.
It's amazing work. I only ask because I do remember some cases where deportation flights were scheduled, where people hadn't had a chance to argue their case fairly, where had they done, they would have won their legal claim to asylum.
I published about a Dronka's case in a book called Queer Outside in Law, and how she was failed by legal aid solicitors, very well-known legal aid solicitors regarding her own case, and she had to draft her own grounds to stop her own injunction. She did a fantastic interview on Radio 4 last week in Love and the Law. Really recommend your listeners to listen to that as well, which is talking about her whole narrative. But equally, I'm not going to say that there are people who are not genuine, but that's not my job. But it's not my role as an advocate, and the system is stacked against them. I had one of my clients earlier this year who had waited 3 years between claiming asylum, registering asylum claim, to get an interview. At the moment, there are just under 120,000 individuals who are waiting for a decision on their asylum claim. So the reason why there's immense costs in hotel accommodation at the moment is that the Home Office aren't making decisions. And the fact that Manston, only today, in the last 24 hours, has been reported to be completely cleared of migrants. One, the issue is Kel-Surprise, the weather's got worse, so there's not many crossings. So why we paid the French government £8 million in the last week when we knew the numbers would go down, drastically down, because of the weather, is beyond my comprehension. But, the fact that Independent Chief Inspector of Prisons and the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, David Neal, said the conditions in that camp were inhuman and degrading. Had scabies and diphtheria. I mean, these are conditions we would read in Dickens. Not what we expect today. But it's only because lawyers have challenged the conditions that the position is that Marsden no longer got no immigrants currently. So it's because the lawyers are challenging. When it came to Afghanistan, the British public made it very clear we would open up our homes to people fleeing persecution from Afghanistan because that's the British value. We provide sanctuary. That's the whole reason why the British ethos, the British heartbeat is to protect. Because, the work I do with queer refugees, remember that there are around 68, 69 countries in the world which currently have some sort of criminalisation of same-sex conduct. Now, about 2/3 of the Commonwealth, so about 30 countries of the Commonwealth, have criminal laws on the statutes which were exported by us as the British Empire. So, I gave evidence to the Women's and Equalities Select Committee earlier this year, and I talked about, what are the pull factors for a lot of individuals who travel halfway around? Well, historical debt. You hear about the empire. I think I said in my evidence, well, the empire strikes back. We have a historical debt to these countries who's exported these laws. There are 40-odd countries in the world which have specific legislation against lesbians. We know that in 2021 to 2022, 390 murders of trans people around the globe. I'm very much trans-inclusive because my trans, non-binary and gender-fluid clients have really taught me what it means to be human. I've been working with trans clients since 2007. Case called Nellie Norma Davis, which was a pensions case in the Social Security Commissioner's Appeal Tribunal. I did that pro bono, and then various cases I've done on queer refugees and current cases I have. And you learn a lot about what it means to be human through my trans and non-binary gender fluid clients.
How do you mean, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I myself knew at 14 that my attractions were towards people of the same sex. I can look back into my childhood. The visual aids I use is that my brother used to have birthday cakes with football fields in R2-D2, and I had birthday cakes with pink roses or butterflies. I didn't know I was queer, but I knew I was different. And I heard this on social media yesterday too. To feel that a human being has been imposed with a name and be living in a body which is not their own. Can you imagine having to live your life like that? That really teaches you how to be human. It's not a choice. That's why I believe the Georgia cultural principles and gender identity is, gender ideology was actually used against women to have ability to be able to control their own bodies and abortions. And that's why we know the far right is very much linked with the gender critical movement. Gender identity has been a definition which has been at least since Georgia cultural principles in 2007. Talk about you don't need to have medical surgical intervention. I think I said it earlier, my husband and I have been together 21 years. And one of the great things is that when you're in love with another human being, you are invincible. And you have that wonderful, amazing feeling that when I'm with my husband to sleep, I hold him to my chest and I know that I will die for him and he will die for me. That makes me invincible. And that's why, for me to try and comprehend why another human being would say to another human being that you cannot be who you are, it's just wrong. Because when you know what passion and love and that ability to give your all to another human being, you know how important it is to be yourself. So I question whether a lot of these people who have these views are people who are basically not in love.
It's a very compassionate way to look at them.
Well, people who are in love don't have these feelings about other human beings. Every individual, the Jim Hathaway approach, that you are a refugee because you flee your country of nationality. What happens is that the receiving state, where you arrive in the UK, has a process which is called refugee status determination. And that's got to be a right of a receiving state to be able to assess your claim. So that's why judges and lawyers like boxes. And the one thing which English legal education taught me was A plus B equals C. What Harvard gave me was you're going to write the letter, let's say J, and you invent a formula. So that revolutionized my approach to the law. I want to get to the letter J. How do I write the formula? Where do I want this to go? I want this to go that just as this is what the Refugee Convention is, if you are a member of a persecuted group and we accept that this group gets persecuted, will get killed, get tortured, raped, whatever in your country, you are a refugee. Who cares that you slipped up and said that you were arrested 4 times rather than 5 times? You are a refugee, and discretion has no element to do with that, because that leads to so many other things, issues in relation to proving straight. That is torturous in itself, because you're having to enter opposite sex relationships with somebody you have no real feeling for, and that partner is in effect being duressed into sexual relations. So you're raping them because you're not your real self. So it involves a lot. But, my Hindu mother said, God says 3 things when you ask God a question: yes, no, and later. And whenever I've lost a case, it's not, oh God, that's the end of it. It's like, come back later. You haven't quite understood the question posed, so I'll come back later in another case. So I'm very much the optimist, because at the grand old age of 48, I'm still there for the long run.
Fantastic. You've mentioned Manston. So for somebody who's going through the asylum claim process, there's several difficult situations they might find themselves in, like Manston, like various other detention centres.
Well, Yarlswood was infamous in relation to women.
Yes, yeah. I understand you can't give away too many details of clients you've worked with and so on, but what is the reality of detention in somewhere like Yarlswood? What's the reality of a place like that?
Well, for example, one of my trans male clients, presented to the UK as female from Pakistan. And because of certain characteristics, when he entered Yarlswood as what was recorded as a biological woman, first of all, it's quite interesting because the person who recorded their entry in Yarlswood used male identification labels, and then fellow female detainees, because you had a chromosomal characteristic, which meant that they used to assault him by putting their hands on his chest because they didn't really believe that this person was a woman enough. Yeah. But also, issues in relation to sexual violence and intimidation. And, I don't believe that anybody needs to be detained when they come into the country. They've come here to seek safety. And knowing that 70 to 80% are genuine, why are we imprisoning them again after them? Many narratives would involve periods of incarceration themselves. There is no need for detention in the majority of these cases. The culture of detention and disbelief is what breeds the impact and effect on the refugee to lose confidence in the system. And it allows the right-wing media and politicians to put everything in monetary terms. And the fact that, they don't call them refugees crossing the channels, they call illegal migrants. Once again, 2021, there was a case in relation to the UK trying to prosecute the individual refugee or refugees in the dinghies who are steering the boat. And they were attempting to prosecute, and the Court of Appeal said, no, these are not illegal entrants, because they're expected to either be picked up in the channel by UK border force or when they arrive to claim asylum. So therefore, up to 28th of June, this year, none of them were illegal entrants, because the Court of Appeal made it quite clear. They changed the law from the 28th of June, but even then. So it's using the rhetoric which is inaccurate. And this is what's so crazy about the situation, is that we've got, politicians who are qualified lawyers who should know better, but they use the rhetoric because, their careers are now very much looking at the prize of politics rather than the prize of law.
Yeah, it's really disgusting to see this rhetoric coming from politicians. And I've never really been able to work out if they're just pure evil and this is what they genuinely want, or if they're pure evil and they're doing it for votes. What's your take on something like that?
I don't think I should say anything on record.
Okay.
I mean, look, let's not get into that discussion because, there are a lot of people who go into politics for public service, and we all know who they are. I mean, that's why I said there's no difference between Conservative or Labour when it comes to immigration and refugee law. I can tell you that as somebody who's been in the field for over 20 years and somebody who saw Labour imposing the reasonable discretion test from 2004 to 2010 to queer refugees. So for me, I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats, but I'm not party to any policy considerations. And there's some issues I have with the recent policy on trans issues. But for me, it's all about the fact that when we look at Zimbabwe, how do we know that a state is starting to fail? Well, because the judges are corrupt. They've been paid by the politicians. They'll do it with a dictator. So because we don't have that in the UK, that's why I'm proud to serve as a barrister, as a lawyer, because I believe, I'm part of the system. It's so easy to say, oh, no, we're fighting the system. I have to accept I'm part of that system. And I have to believe the system works because otherwise I wouldn't be part of it.
I do admire that optimism as well. So to end on a hopeful note, I know you've said that you'd never get into politics, but if you ever did have your hands on the lever, what would you like to see change? You've mentioned you'd get rid of detention centres already. What else would you like to see change?
Well, we need proper legal aid public funding for refugee claims. I mean, the government have a fixed fee of, I think, £300 to £320 for barristers representing a refugee before the first year tribunal. That covers, unless it's exceptional fees. I mean, this is basically trying to price out good lawyers from doing the work. But the problem is we will still do the work because we believe that these clients need representation. As I said, we will always be fired up by the fact that we have the power to empower our clients to save lives and change lives.
That's a really beautiful message. And for anyone listening who's inspired to go out and get involved and wants to support people going through the asylum process, maybe, what, in your experience, have been some of the best ways that people can get involved?
Well, go on the net. Social media is wonderful. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Mastodon as well. S_Chelvan at mast.to. But no, I mean, join social networks, join support groups. There's lots of volunteer groups. I was speaking to somebody I'm mentoring at the moment who's working with Detention Action. And there's so many other refugee organisations. Find your USP, because a lot of people don't focus, especially if they want to go into a career in law. You need to focus on what drives you, what makes you passionate, especially if you're going into this area of law, what drives you, and get your core skills in going out there. And I think the greatest skill as an advocate is not necessarily the speaking role, but the ability to listen. And that's why it goes back to my original USB, to be the mouthpiece for those who know the words but have no voice. You can only be that mouthpiece, you can only be that storyteller, you can only be that interpreter by creating that safe space for the refugee to speak and to be heard.
It's a really beautiful note to end on. Dr S Chelvan, thank you so much for coming on to the Rebel Justice podcast. I wish I could ask you a million more questions, but it's been so fantastic to hear everything that you've had to say. So thank you so much, and we wish you all the very best with your work in the future.
Thank you very much.
If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Chelvan's work, you can follow him on Twitter at S_Chelvan or on Mastodon, S_Chelvan at mass.to. Make sure you catch the next in our series, where I'll be speaking with Lucky Kambule, a refugee from South Africa who successfully fought back against detention conditions in Ireland and founded MASSI, the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland. Thank you for listening to the Rebel Justice podcast.